Sometimes the bravest souls are the ones who carry scars. In a quiet corner of Seattle, a young German shepherd named Rocco found himself cast aside, his hopes of becoming a proud police canine dashed by a failed test. Fate, though, had a different plan. Day after day, Rocco kept returning to a rusted shipping container near the edge of the old waterfront, drawn by something no one else could see. When a concerned officer followed him inside, their world changed forever. This is the story of a dog's unwavering loyalty, a hidden secret, and the power of second chances. Rocco was never meant to be an ordinary dog. From the moment he was whelped in a small kennel just outside Seattle, the breeders saw something special in his bright, curious eyes. He was the biggest pup of his litter, a German shepherd with powerful hind legs and a strong, regal stance. They believed he was destined for great things, perhaps a future in law enforcement or search and rescue. When he turned 8 weeks old, a trainer from the Seattle Police Department's K9 unit visited the kennel, evaluating each pup's potential. Rocco outshone his siblings in almost every test: agility, drive, and focus. The police trainer was impressed, making notes and nodding in approval. Little did anyone know then that fate would lead Rocco down a winding path lined with heartbreak and, ultimately, redemption. The day Rocco left the kennel for the K9 Training Academy, the air was thick with excitement. Patrol cars and specialized K9 vehicles were lined up outside the sprawling facility, a place known for shaping some of the city's finest four-legged officers. Rocco's handler in training, Sergeant Mark Wilson, was a seasoned officer who had spent years working with dogs of every temperament. He immediately took a liking to Rocco's energy and intelligence. Though Rocco excelled in detection, exercises sniffing out hidden objects and responding swiftly to commands, there was an unspoken tension flickering in his eyes. It was as if Rocco sensed something was off within him, a quiet doubt buried beneath his exuberant spirit. Training days were long and grueling. From dawn till dusk, Rocco practiced tracking, obedience, agility, and controlled aggression. He jumped over walls, crawled under barbed wire fences, and dashed through obstacle courses designed to challenge the bravest dogs. His performance was remarkable, yet there was a slight hesitation whenever loud noises echoed across the training field. The crack of simulated gunfire or the sudden bang of a door slamming caused Rocco's ears to flatten and his stance to stiffen. Though he never bolted, that split-second tremor of uncertainty did not go unnoticed by the instructors. It was a delicate problem, one that might be ironed out with focused drills or might become a permanent block. As weeks turned into months, Rocco's progress was lauded, yet quietly scrutinized. Sergeant Wilson and the other trainers poured their efforts into addressing his anxiety around sharp noises. Some days, Rocco seemed to conquer his fears, leaping into action without a flinch. Other days, he recoiled from the very training exercises he had completed flawlessly just the day before. The roller coaster of success and regression began to weigh heavily on everyone. Still, no one could deny Rocco's heart. He worked tirelessly, never giving up, and often tried to rally his fellow canine trainees whenever they seemed sluggish. The dog's spirit was indomitable, even if his nerves were frayed. One crisp autumn morning, the entire K9 unit was put through a final series of evaluations. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the training grounds. Each dog and their handler had to demonstrate mastery of crucial skills, tracking a suspect, detecting hidden narcotics, and responding to real-time commands during simulated confrontations. Rocco had performed admirably in the detection and obedience phases, but during the simulated confrontation, where blank gunfire was used, his old hesitation returned. A single loud shot rang out, and Rocco froze, Though it lasted only a heartbeat, that moment of indecision was enough. The evaluators exchanged grim looks, and Sergeant Wilson's face fell. In the final tally, Rocco's performance was marked as insufficient. The official reason was that he lacked the consistent stability required for high-risk police work. No matter how skilled, a dog that might freeze at a critical juncture could put both officers and bystanders in danger. The decision came down from the top. Rocco would be removed from the K9 program. Sergeant Wilson pleaded for more time, insisting that Rocco just needed specialized training and continued exposure therapy for his noise sensitivity. But budgets were tight, and the force needed new recruits to be ready quickly. Rocco, once hailed as the rising star, was formally rejected. Rejection hit Rocco harder than anyone expected. Though dogs often adapt quickly to new environments, there was a distinct sadness in his eyes as Sergeant Wilson placed him back in the kennel. The staff who had grown fond of him felt an ache in their hearts, seeing this bright, eager dog sidelined through no real fault of his own. The plan was to transition Rocco into a different program or potentially find a civilian home for him. But as the days passed, Rocco seemed restless, pacing in his kennel, whining at the slightest sound of distant sirens. It was as if he knew his path had been altered irrevocably. Meanwhile, Officer Carlos Ramirez, a junior police officer who assisted in training programs, couldn't get Rocco out of his mind. He'd seen countless dogs come and go, some soared to the top of the class, others never made it past basic obedience. Yet there was something about Rocco's unwavering determination, his willingness to work until he nearly collapsed from exhaustion, that struck a chord in Carlos. When Rocco failed that crucial test, Carlos felt a pang of injustice. He believed wholeheartedly that with the right approach, the dog could still serve the community. But as a junior officer, he had limited influence on such decisions. Word soon spread about Rocco's predicament. Some senior officers shrugged, reasoning that not every dog was cut out for the job. Others grumbled about wasted potential. A few whispered rumors that Rocco had been cursed with bad luck. Carlos, however, refused to accept these dismissals. Every morning, he visited Rocco in his kennel, spending a few minutes just talking to him in a soothing tone. He'd scratch behind Rocco's ears, share tidbits from his breakfast, and promise that he wouldn't give up on him. Rocco, in turn, would press his muzzle through the bars, licking Carlos's hand as if to say he understood. The day they took Rocco away from the academy, Carlos made a silent vow to keep tabs on the dog's fate. Rocco was transferred to a local animal shelter for retired or unfit service dogs, a facility that prided itself on finding suitable homes for animals no longer in training. The building was a far cry from the lively training grounds. The corridors were quiet, and the dogs within carried a certain solemn air. Rocco's new kennel, though clean and safe, felt barren compared to the dynamic environment he had known. It was there, in that shelter, that strange things began to happen. Late into the night, the staff would hear whining and scratching at the chain-link gate. Sometimes they'd check Rocco's kennel and find it empty. Yet, in the morning, he'd be curled up in his bedding as though he hadn't moved all night. The mystery intensified when neighbors reported seeing a German shepherd near the old waterfront. One caretaker decided to stay late, determined to see how Rocco was escaping. Sure enough, around midnight, Rocco began to paw at a small rusted section of fencing near the rear of the enclosure. Within minutes, he wriggled through the gap and bounded into the darkness. Rather than sound the alarm, the caretaker followed at a distance. Curiosity piqued. Rocco moved swiftly yet cautiously through the silent streets, heading for the waterfront where large shipping containers were stacked like metal giants. Eventually, Rocco stopped before one battered red container with peeling paint and a set of large numbers scrawled across its side, CMACGM, an international shipping brand. This real name stood out, a tangible anchor to the modern world. The caretaker watched in astonishment as Rocco placed his paws on the container's door and began to scratch lightly. For several minutes, Rocco remained transfixed by the container. His ears perked, tail wagging slowly, as though listening for something inside. Nothing but the distant lapping of water on the pier could be heard. Then Rocco turned and trotted back to the shelter as if he had confirmed a secret known only to him. When the caretaker recounted the events to his colleagues the next day, they were baffled. Why this particular container? What was Rocco sensing inside? News of Rocco's nocturnal excursions reached Carlos through a mutual friend. Intrigued, he decided to see it for himself. One crisp evening, he borrowed an unmarked car and parked at a vantage point overlooking the warehouse district. Sure enough, under the faint glow of a half-moon, Rocco appeared, trotting along the deserted dockyards. Carlos followed on foot, his heart pounding with both excitement and worry. He trailed the dog, careful to remain hidden behind the towering piles of crates and containers. When Rocco reached the battered red container, he repeated the same ritual, standing on his hind legs, pressing his front paws against the steel door and scratching gently. Carlos held his breath, half expecting someone or something to appear, but all was silent. After a few minutes, Rocco lowered himself and sat, staring at the container's door. The night wind ruffled his fur, and for a moment Carlos thought he saw the dog tilt his head as if listening to a faint whisper from within. Then, just as before, Rocco turned and slipped away into the darkness. Carlos didn't sleep that night. Instead, he mulled over what he had witnessed, trying to piece together the puzzle. If Rocco was drawn to that container, there had to be a reason, a scent, a sound, or perhaps something deeper that only Rocco could perceive. He resolved to investigate. The next day, using his official credentials, he managed to trace the container's shipping records through the port of Seattle. According to the logs, the container had arrived from overseas months ago, filled with electronics. It was scheduled to be moved, but had somehow been forgotten at this remote section of the dock. With the help of a friendly dock worker, Carlos got permission to open the container. He arrived that evening with a crowbar in hand, heart pounding with anticipation. Before prying open the door, he checked the perimeter. There, sitting patiently in the shadows, was Rocco. The dog had escaped once again, determined to guard his secret. Carlos approached slowly, speaking to Rocco in a soft voice. "I'm here to help you," he murmured. Rocco's tail thumped against the ground in a subdued wag, as though he understood. Together, they stood before the rusted red container. The door groaned in protest as Carlos wedged the crowbar beneath the latch. A pungent smell of stale air wafted out when it finally gave way. The interior was dimly lit by the fading glow of nearby floodlights. At first glance, it seemed empty. Crates of electronics had been cleared out long ago, leaving only a few wooden pallets strewn about. But Rocco bounded inside, nose low to the floor, sniffing fervently. He led Carlos toward the far corner, where a small vent let in a thin trickle of air. From beneath a collapsed pallet, a faint whimper emerged. Carlos's heart lurched. He carefully lifted the pallet, revealing a tiny figure curled up against the steel wall. It was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, thin, trembling, and covered in dirt. His eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and relief as he saw the silhouettes above him. Rocco's nose gently nudged the boy's arm, and the child let out a tearful gasp. Instinct took over for Carlos. He scooped the boy into his arms, checking for injuries. The boy looked malnourished, but breathing. He clung to Carlos with what little strength he had, tears streaming down his cheeks. In that moment, the gravity of it all hit Carlos with the force of a tidal wave. A child was hiding or trapped in this forsaken container. The boy's clothes were tattered, his hair matted. There was no telling how long he'd been there. He seemed too weak to speak, only managing a faint nod when Carlos asked if he could understand English. With Rocco by his side, Carlos rushed out of the container, carrying the boy toward the street where his unmarked car awaited. Words tumbled out of Carlos's mouth, a flurry of reassurances that they would get him to safety. Later that night, at Seattle Children's Hospital, doctors examined the boy. They found signs of dehydration, malnutrition, and minor bruises. Still, they were optimistic. He'd make a full recovery with proper care. The boy remained quiet, his eyes darting nervously whenever someone approached. He clung to Rocco, who was allowed to stay by his side for comfort. In the quiet hum of the hospital corridor, Carlos learned that the boy's name was Thomas, a name that would soon grip the hearts of everyone at the Seattle Police Department. Through painstaking effort and the help of a translator, authorities discovered fragments of Tomas's story. He had arrived illegally on a cargo ship, separated from his family under circumstances that were still unclear. With no guardian to watch over him, he'd ended up in that container, surviving on scraps. At some point, the container was moved to the deserted dock area, leaving him stranded. How or when Rocco first sensed Tomas's presence remained a mystery. Perhaps it was some faint cry carried on the wind, or maybe an echo of a child's heartbeat that only a dog's keen ears could detect. News of the discovery spread quickly, and media outlets swarmed the hospital and the docks, seeking any detail of the miraculous rescue. Interviews with Officer Carlos Ramirez and those who knew about Rocco's rejection from the canine unit painted a poignant picture. A dog deemed unfit for police service had single-handedly uncovered a missing child. Public sentiment surged in Rocco's favor. Social media exploded with messages of support, calling for Rocco's reinstatement or, at the very least, a commendation. The Seattle community rallied around Rocco, demanding that this heroic canine not be discarded. For Rocco, life changed overnight. He went from a lonely kennel to a beloved figure in the hospital's halls. Nurses and patients alike fawned over him, providing treats and gentle pats on the head. And yet, for all the newfound attention, Rocco remained focused on Tomas. Whenever Thomas became anxious or frightened, sometimes at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, Rocco would press close, offering silent reassurance. A bond formed, rooted in gratitude and need. Thomas's health improved steadily, and with every step in his recovery, Rocco was at his side. Meanwhile, Carlos worked tirelessly to untangle Tomas's circumstances. The Department of Social and Health Services became involved, searching for any trace of family. If relatives couldn't be found, Tomas might end up in the foster care system. This weighed heavily on Carlos, who had grown up in a tough neighborhood himself. He knew how traumatizing it could be for a child to navigate the system alone, especially one from another country. Deep down, he wondered if he might do more for Tomas than just rescue him from a container. Could he, in good conscience, walk away now that the immediate danger had passed? The story took a surprising turn when Sergeant Wilson, Rocco's former trainer, visited the hospital. He found Rocco curled at Tomas's feet, and the image tugged at his heart. Wilson admitted to Carlos that perhaps they had made a mistake by dismissing Rocco too soon. If he can sense a lone child in a shipping container, maybe he just needs the right environment to thrive, Wilson confessed. Carlos, who was still technically a junior officer, stood in quiet agreement. But it wasn't so simple. The K9 program had specific protocols, and one heroic act, however miraculous, might not be enough to overturn a formal rejection. Nonetheless, public pressure grew. Local news stations picked up the heartwarming story, framing Rocco as the dog who wouldn't give up. A grassroots campaign started online, calling on the Seattle Police Department to reconsider Rocco's future. Letters poured in from citizens offering to adopt him if the police force truly had no place for him. Even the city council took notice, with some members praising Rocco's instincts and calling for an internal review. In the midst of the media frenzy, the only thing Rocco seemed to care about was Thomas's steady recovery. Days turned to weeks. Thomas regained strength, and though he was still shy around new people, he had moments of bright laughter, especially when Rocco was near. The boy found solace in the dog's steady presence, his wagging tail a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. Carlos, driven by a sense of responsibility, filed paperwork to become Thomas's temporary guardian. The red tape was extensive, but authorities recognized that the boy had already formed a meaningful connection with Carlos and Rocco. Eventually, the paperwork was approved, though on a provisional basis. On the day Thomas was finally discharged from the hospital, a small crowd of reporters gathered outside. Cameras flashed as Carlos and Rocco guided the boy to a waiting car. Thomas shielded his face, nervous about the attention, but Rocco stood protectively at his side. Once they were settled, Carlos led them to a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place he had hastily prepared to accommodate Thomas. The apartment was no palace, but it was clean, warm, and safe. Rocco wagged his tail as they entered, as if understanding that this was now home for all of them. Adapting to a new life was a challenge. Thomas struggled with nightmares, haunted by memories of being alone in that dark container and whatever terrors had led him there. Sometimes he would wake up screaming, covered in cold sweat. Rocco was always the first to respond, bounding into the bedroom to nuzzle the boy's face or curl up beside him. Gradually, Thomas's night terrors lessened in severity. It was as though Rocco's calming presence anchored him to the present, reminding him that he was no longer alone. Carlos did his best to juggle work responsibilities while caring for Thomas. He enrolled the boy in a local school, explained his unique situation to teachers, and ensured that he had regular therapy sessions. Their language barrier remained, but every day Thomas picked up more English words. Meanwhile, Rocco took on the role of an unofficial therapy dog. If Thomas grew anxious in public places, a crowded grocery store, or a busy sidewalk, Rocco would plant himself by the boy's side, offering silent assurance that everything was okay. Strangers often smiled at the unlikely trio, sensing the bond that held them together. Back at the police station, debate raged on about Rocco's future. Some officials argued that a single success did not guarantee the dog's reliability in dangerous situations. Others felt that ignoring Rocco's potential was a mistake, especially after he had already proven his ability to detect a life in peril. In the midst of the bureaucratic tug-of-war, Sergeant Wilson proposed a compromise. Rocco could undergo a specialized form of training, focusing on search and rescue rather than direct confrontation. This program, though less common, was still under the umbrella of police work. If Rocco could pass the certification tests for search and rescue, he might serve the department in a capacity that suited his temperament better. When Carlos learned of the proposal, he was hesitant. He had grown protective of Rocco, not wanting him to be subjected to another round of grueling tests, only to face potential rejection. But a glimmer of hope sparked in him. This might be Rocco's chance to fulfill his original destiny. After discussing it with Thomas, who nodded enthusiastically though he probably understood only half of what was said, Carlos agreed to let Rocco train for search and rescue. The next challenge was balancing the dog's training schedule with the demands of caring for a young child. Training began anew, this time under a different unit's guidance. The exercises focused on honing a dog's ability to locate missing persons in various terrains, dense forests, collapsed buildings, or remote urban areas. Loud noises were minimized in the initial stages, allowing Rocco to build confidence. Over time, simulated distractions were gradually introduced: sirens, shouting, and the clang of heavy machinery. To everyone's relief, Rocco's hesitation around sharp sounds had diminished. He still showed a moment's pause, but it was accompanied by a quick recovery, fueled by his strong desire to complete the search. His sense of smell, which had once detected a lone child in a cargo container, was refined further. Soon, Rocco could pick up human scent trails, even in challenging conditions. The real test came when they staged a nighttime search scenario in a wooded park outside the city. The missing person was actually a volunteer who had wandered off the main path. Under the moonlight, with only a few scattered flashlights to guide them, Rocco and Carlos began their search. In minutes, Rocco caught a scent and barreled into the underbrush, ears alert and nose quivering. Through thick brambles and uneven terrain, he led Carlos straight to the volunteer, who was well hidden under a fallen tree trunk. The entire exercise took less than half the time most trainees needed. The observers took note of Rocco's intense focus and unwavering dedication. As the weeks passed, Rocco's reputation blossomed. Word spread within the department that the rejected dog was rapidly becoming one of the most promising search and rescue candidates. Carlos felt a swell of pride whenever he heard colleagues speak highly of Rocco. He also noticed how the training seemed to energize the dog, giving him a sense of purpose. At home, Rocco was affectionate and gentle, especially with Tomas. But when the vest went on and they arrived at the training grounds, Rocco snapped into professional mode, ready to track and rescue at a moment's notice. In the meantime, Tomas made slow but steady progress in school. He was placed in an English language learner program where patient teachers helped him catch up academically. Though shy, he displayed a remarkable empathy that endeared him to classmates. On days that were particularly overwhelming, Tomas would whisper Rocco under his breath, as if invoking the dog's calming presence, even when they were apart. An unforeseen development occurred one late afternoon when immigration services officials arrived at the police station. They wanted to interview Tomas, inquiring about his origins and the possibility of deportation. Carlos's stomach churned. The boy had no documents, no clear records, and the only family tie he had was a rumor that his mother might still be alive somewhere in Central America. The prospect of losing Tomas to a bureaucratic decision was almost too much to bear. Yet it was the law, and Carlos had to cooperate, even if it broke his heart. During the interview, Tomas clammed up, fear evident in his eyes. That night, he refused to eat, staring vacantly at the dinner plate. Rocco stayed by his side, resting his muzzle on the boy's knee. Carlos racked his mind for solutions. He consulted with legal aid organizations, explaining the unique situation and hoping to secure some form of protective status for Tomas. Weeks of uncertainty loomed, and it weighed on the small family. Despite the looming threat of separation, life moved forward. Rocco's final search and rescue certification exam approached. The test was notoriously difficult, involving a simulated disaster site at an abandoned warehouse. Multiple victims were hidden in precarious locations, some in the rafters, some buried beneath rubble, others in dark corners. Rocco would have only a limited window to find them all. Carlos was nervous. He knew how much was riding on this. Yet, as they arrived on site, Rocco radiated a calm intensity, as though he understood what was expected of him. The exam began at dusk. Instructors monitored from a safe distance, clipboards in hand. Carlos unleashed Rocco at the starting point, giving the command to find. Rocco sprinted into the wreckage, nose lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the hidden volunteers. Within minutes, he alerted on the first victim, pawing at a mound of debris and barking. Rescue team members retrieved the volunteer, who gave a thumbs up. Next, Rocco darted toward the far end of the warehouse, weaving between twisted metal beams. Twice he paused at sudden noises, a distant siren, the creak of a shifting pile of rubble, but each time he pressed on. Nearly an hour passed, and Rocco found 4 of the 5 victims. Time was running short. Carlos's heart pounded as he urged Rocco to keep searching. The final victim was cleverly concealed in an air duct above a collapsed staircase. Rocco scoured the perimeter, sniffing at walls and corners, occasionally whining in frustration. The examiners cast glances at their watches. Carlos felt the seconds slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. Finally, Rocco halted, head craned upward. He let out a single bark at the rusted duct. Helpers rushed to investigate, finding the volunteer cramped inside, hardly able to move. Relief washed over everyone, and the examiners marked their final notes. Rocco had found all 5 victims in record time. The lead instructor nodded, a rare smile touching his lips as he removed his safety helmet. "That dog's a natural," he said, turning to Carlos. "You've got something special there, Officer Ramirez." For Carlos, it felt like a vindication not just for Rocco, but for every dog that had ever been cast aside for showing one flaw. He walked over and hugged Rocco around the neck, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Rocco licked his face, tail wagging in a playful blur. Word of Rocco's triumph spread quickly through the station. Suddenly, the same officials who had once dismissed him were congratulating Carlos and praising Rocco's abilities. Discussions began about officially bringing Rocco on as a search and rescue dog within the department. Local newspapers ran headlines like "Rejected Canine finds his calling and hero dog's second chance." The city's residents, having followed the story closely, cheered the news. Meanwhile, offers of financial assistance and adoption for Tomas poured in from Good Samaritans across the country. Yet, beneath the jubilation, a question lingered: what would become of Tomas? The immigration hearing loomed on the calendar like a dark cloud. The day of the hearing arrived with a knot of tension in Carlos's stomach. He dressed Tomas in the best clothes he could afford, and they headed to the courthouse. Rocco remained outside with a friend, as dogs typically weren't allowed in the hearing rooms. But even that short separation caused Tomas's anxiety to spike. The hearing was formal, the judge stern. Representatives from immigration laid out the boy's undocumented status. Carlos spoke passionately on Tomas's behalf, explaining how they found him, the role Rocco played, and the progress Tomas had made since. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the notes before him. Just when it seemed the hearing was going poorly, the door opened unexpectedly, and in walked a man in a crisp suit, an attorney affiliated with a prominent child advocacy group. He presented new evidence, a possible lead on Tomas's mother, who had been searching for her son through a different humanitarian organization. The mother, reportedly still abroad, had filed paperwork to petition for Tomas's safety if he was found. She wanted her child to have a stable life, even if it meant staying in the United States. The judge's demeanor softened as he reviewed the documents. For the first time in that hearing, hope glimmered. The judge decided to grant Tomas a special protective status while the legal system worked to verify his mother's claims and arrange for a potential reunion. The process could take months, even years. In the meantime, Tomas would remain in Carlos's care with regular check-ins. A tear of relief slid down Carlos's cheek as the gavel struck, finalizing the ruling. Outside the courthouse, Rocco greeted them with a flurry of excited barks, as if sensing the good news. Tomas wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, whispering a grateful, "Gracias, Rocco." Life began to stabilize. Rocco officially joined the Seattle Police Department Search and Rescue Division. He and Carlos were on call for emergencies, whether it was a missing hiker in the Cascade Mountains or a child lost in a crowded festival. The father and son dynamic between Carlos and Tomas blossomed. While the legal system sorted out Tomas's case, he settled into a routine, school, therapy sessions, time at the park, and the occasional ride along with Carlos and Rocco, though he had to wait safely at the station whenever they were dispatched for actual calls. One evening, after a long day, the three of them relaxed in the living room, which had become filled with small, personal touches. Thomas's drawings on the fridge, Rocco's chew toys scattered on the floor, and a second-hand guitar that Thomas plucked at occasionally. Carlos couldn't shake the memory of that first night he followed Rocco to the container. It all felt surreal, how a single act of defiance by a rejected dog had set off a chain of events that changed so many lives. He glanced at Tomas, who was now dozing on the couch with Rocco curled protectively at his feet, and realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. As the months turned into a year, all the pieces of their story fell into place. Rocco's name was etched onto a plaque honoring the city's most celebrated service animals. Thomas's case inched forward with the promise that he might soon be reunited with his mother, or that she might secure a visa to visit him. Meanwhile, the Seattle community continued to celebrate the remarkable bond between a boy, a dog, and an officer who refused to abandon hope. Through it all, Rocco remained the steadfast hero he had always been, whether recognized by the authorities or not. In his eyes, the only thing that truly mattered was the connection forged by loyalty and love. And that was exactly what Carlos and Thomas offered him, day in and day out. No badges, no ribbons, just the warmth of a home where he belonged. In quiet moments, Carlos would watch Thomas and Rocco playing in the park, their laughter and barking mingling in the air. He would reflect on the path they'd taken, the heartbreak of rejection, the mystery of the shipping container, and the miracle of finding Thomas just in time. Every step had tested their resolve, but it also revealed the profound resilience each carried within. Together, they had rewritten not just Rocco's future, but Thomas's and Carlos's as well. No longer just a dog cast aside, Rocco had found his calling and, in doing so, saved a life that others might have overlooked. Tomas, once a frightened child hidden away in a container, now had a chance to thrive and dream of a better tomorrow. Carlos, a junior officer who questioned his own place in the force, discovered a deeper purpose than he'd ever imagined. Their story became an emblem of what could happen when faith, perseverance, and compassion converged. And in the end, the most important thing wasn't that Rocco had been rejected, it was that he'd never stopped trying. When the rest of the world gave up on him, he didn't give up on the world, or on Tomas, or on Carlos. That is the legacy of a rejected police dog who found his way back to a mysterious container, again and again, until someone listened. What they found inside changed not just Tomas's life, but all their lives forever. Even now, when Rocco patrols the city in his search and rescue vest, people point and wave, children whisper his name, and families remind each other that hope can come from the unlikeliest places. If anyone doubts it, they need only look at the wagging tail of a once rejected dog and the shining smile of a boy who now calls him family. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey that proves miracles can be found in the most unexpected places. We hope Rocco's story touched your heart and reminded you of the resilience within us all. If this tale of second chances and loyalty resonated with you, please support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Every click helps us spread messages of hope and courage. Your support means everything to us, and it fuels our mission to bring you true stories that celebrate the bravery of everyday heroes. Let's honor Rocco's legacy by believing in the impossible and standing up for those who deserve a chance. We're grateful you spent your time with us and can't wait to share more inspiring tales. With your help, we can keep delivering stories that uplift and inspire. Until next time, remember, Hope, love, and determination can light the darkest corners, even those hidden behind rusted doors.